Buenos días, señores. Lo voy a cambiar para hablar un poco más íntimo. Buenos días. Hoy vamos a hablar de los complementos indirectos en español. Esto es algo no complicado, pero puede ser un poco complicadito a veces. Entonces, ya voy a empezar en inglés, ¿vale? Today we're going to be talking about indirect object and indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Something not necessarily difficult, but it is something that we have to spend a little bit of time with because it may be new for many of you. If you remember, we've already looked at direct object and direct object pronouns in this class. Direct objects, if you remember, were things that received the direct action of the verb. We first approached this idea when we were learning the a personal. If you remember, the a personal was a preposition that we needed to place before direct objects that were people. This was all the way back in chapter 4 or something along those lines. So direct objects were things that received the direct action of the verb. It was, for instance, if I were to say, I eat the pizza would be the direct object. The direct object would also be a person. If I had a sentence such as, I call Jonathan, Jonathan is the direct object in that sentence. Today what we're looking at is something different. Today we're looking at indirect objects. And so if you remember that a direct object was what received the direct action of the verb, you can therefore understand that an indirect object is what receives the indirect action of the verb. And now, in order to figure out what the indirect object is in a sentence, we generally ask ourselves the question, to whom or for whom? Sometimes from whom. So if I were to say, I give the car to John, I give the car to whom? To John. Okay? This is how we figure out what an indirect object is. So an indirect object receives the indirect action of the verb, and it's generally to whom or for whom is the question that we ask ourselves to figure out what the indirect object is. Now, in English, we use indirect object pronouns just as we do in Spanish. So in English, for instance, if you say to me, did you give the car to John? We know that John is the indirect object. It might be very normal for me to respond, yes, I gave the car to him. Instead of saying to John once again, I would say to him. This is also indirect object pronouns when I say, for instance, you give the car to me. To me, me is our indirect object pronoun there. I offer my sweater to Susie. Susie is the indirect object there. Sweater is the direct object. Right? I is the subject of the sentence. Offer is the verb of the sentence. Sweater is the direct object. And Susie is the indirect object. So, just as in English, in Spanish we're oftentimes going to want to replace our indirect object with an indirect object pronoun. Indirect object pronouns in Spanish, once you've already learned the direct objects, are quite easy because in most of the cases they're the same. So if I want to say to me, the word is just me. Right? To you would be te. Here's where it would change. In the third person form, we'd get the word le in the singular and les in the past. We'll look at that more closely. But besides those two, they're all the same as the direct objects. Okay, let's look at how we use them, look at when we use them, and talk a little bit more about them. So first let's just look at an example in English. I give the car to Juan. Remember, I would be our subject in the sentence. Give would be our verb in the sentence. The car is our direct object. And Juan is our indirect object. He answers the question, to whom or for whom? The car is going to Juan, so he's the indirect object. Indirect object receives the indirect action of the verb. Let's look at an example of what it might look like in Spanish. Yo le doy el coche a Juan. Okay? Let's notice what's going on here. Things that we might recognize. We have our subject, yo. We have our verb, doy, to give, or I give. El coche is our direct object, and Juan is our indirect object. Now notice here that I have le in here. Le is one of our indirect object pronouns. Something may seem a bit strange to you. There's a redundancy here that we would never have in English. In English, I would either say, I give the car to Juan, or I give the car to him. But essentially what we're saying in this sentence is I, to him, give the car to John. Okay? So, this is an important thing to realize. If a sentence has an indirect object, meaning I give it to him, I borrow it from her, I offer it to them, if there is an indirect object in the sentence, such as Juan, we must have an indirect object pronoun in the sentence as well. And it is redundant, but it's just the way that it's done. What we do not need to have grammatically is the indirect object itself. So we can say this sentence as merely yo le doy el coche. Yo le doy el coche would mean I give the car to him. Whereas this sentence would be translated as I give the car to Juan. Okay, but either way, we always need an indirect object pronoun. So if a sentence has an indirect object, it must have an indirect object pronoun. It would not be okay, to say that. That sentence would be wrong. Yo doy el coche a Juan would be an incorrect sentence. Okay, so if a sentence has an indirect object, it must have an indirect object pronoun. Let's look at all the different indirect object pronouns, and then we'll practice them a little bit more. So as I said a moment ago, our indirect object pronouns in Spanish are almost identical to our direct object pronouns. So we're still going to see me and te. Over here we're going to see nos and os. No difference there. And here we'll have le, and here we'll have les. There's no masculine or feminine in the indirect object pronouns. There's le and les. The direct object pronouns, remember, had a masculine and feminine here, and a masculine and a feminine here. So me, te, le, nos, os, les. Where do we place them? Placement of indirect object pronouns is exactly the same as the placement of direct object pronouns. We can either put it before a conjugated verb, or we can put it after and attached to an infinitive or a present participle, or known as the gerund as well. So for instance, if I want to say, let's think of a good example here. I pay the waiter the tip. I give the waiter the tip. So I give is doy. The tip is la propina. To the waiter would be al camarero. And as I said a minute ago, if we have an indirect object in the sentence, we must have an indirect object pronoun. Our most common placement of it is directly before a conjugated verb. Le doy la propina al camarero. I give the waiter the tip. If we already know that we're talking about the waiter, if you say to me, are you giving the waiter the tip? And I say, yes, I'm giving the waiter the tip, then I don't need to say this part anymore. So from a grammatical point of view, al camarero here is unnecessary. However, it often is necessary if we want to give certain amounts of information. If you're asking me, who are you giving the tip to? Well, then it's important that I say al camarero so that I actually answer your question. In many cases, as in me and te, nos and os, there's no need for anything over there because we already know who we're talking about. If I say, me das el regalo, you give me the gift, there's absolutely no confusion about who's getting the gift. It's obvious that you're giving the gift to me because this can only mean one thing. Same as if I write, nos das el regalo. You give the gift to us. No confusion once again. Okay? We can also, as I said, place these indirect object pronouns at the end of an infinitive or a present participle. So for instance, voy a darle la propina. I am going to give him or her the tip. Voy a darle. Let's look at a couple of examples for you to practice this a little bit. I'll write a few sentences on the board that you can translate. All right, so maybe pause your video, take a few minutes, try to translate these yourselves. If there's any of the words you don't know, you can look them up in the dictionary. And then when you come back, which should be now, we will look at the translations. So, I write a letter to my friends. One of the easiest ways to do this is let's not even put the indirect object pronoun in until we've written the rest of the sentence. This will help us as we start off. So I write would be escribo. A letter would be una carta. To my friends would be a mis amigos. So remember, if we look through this sentence, this is our verb, our direct object, and our indirect object. Because we have an indirect object in this sentence, we need to have an indirect object pronoun. Mis amigos would be a third person, plural. And so our indirect object pronoun in this case would be les. Les escribo una carta a mis amigos. They lend me the money. They lend would be prestan. The money would be el dinero. So that means they lend the money, and we want to say they lend me the money. So we put me in here. Me prestan el dinero. She tells them the truth. Ella dice la verdad, meaning she tells the truth. She tells them the truth. We need to put third person plural. Indirect object pronoun in there, so les, oh, excuse me, look at that, I messed it up. Les dice la verdad. Okay, so this is one of these other things in Spanish that we've seen things like this before that I really don't think are difficult. With some practice, this is something you can really become really good at quite quickly. It is important that you get these down well, because there are a lot of indirect objects in Spanish, which means there are a lot of indirect object pronouns in Spanish as far as usage goes. And so they're going to be used very often. Also, we'll soon be looking, I believe in the next chapter, we'll be looking at indirect object pronouns and direct object pronouns used together, which is something that's going to be a little bit more complex and something we really want to get down well. So in order to get that down well, the indirect and direct being used together, it's very important that you have this down very well. So I would definitely spend some time on this and use the other resources provided on the Moodle site. Go to the PowerPoint, check out the, well, you have to do the quiz, and check out some of the other materials that I've offered, which I think you'll find helpful. Okay? Gracias, hasta luego, nos vemos.